The title of my topic today is how growing complexity is changing the skills that our students need and how we need to adapt as educators. And if you have studied the program, you will notice that I gave a talk with the same title yesterday in a conversational session. And that session was really intended to help me gather some data about what other folks are doing to deal with today's world. So this is going to be a very compressed version of the session, and I'm going to skip over a lot of the sort of theoretical development that took an hour yesterday. And for people who are interested in how I got to the middle where I'll start in this presentation, I encourage you to speak with me. I'm happy to give you the slides and talk about things in more detail. So what I'm going to talk about today is, how task complexity is changing in today's environment, the types of skills that we need to cope with that complexity, and how we can help our students acquire those skills. Because I would argue that the skill match between the skills required today are very, very different from the skills when I was in school in the 1960s and early 70s. And we need to accommodate that in our educational efforts. So let me start with a very, very brief introduction to task complexity. This is what took an hour in the previous presentation, so you're going to get the 2-minute version. Task complexity is a term that has been really fuzzy in the literature. Everyone recognizes it's important, but nobody actually knows what it is. And for years, I've been trying to unsort this. And I think one of the insights that I have had is that there are really 3 domains in which complexity exists, and they are very, very different domains. And you have to be very specific in terms of what type of complexity you're talking about. So when I talk about terms like difficulty and so forth, I am dealing with what we experience. And Karl Popper basically has proposed 3 worlds, and one of those worlds involves the world that goes on inside our head. It's primarily an analog world. It consists of things like feelings and experiences. And when we talk about things like difficulty, uncertainty, and ambiguity as a result of complexity, we are dealing with experienced complexity. This type of complexity tends to go down as you practice tasks over and over again. Now, there's another world of complexity, which is complexity as it's manifested in symbols. Now, we use symbols in our mind to do certain things. For example, if I asked you to multiply two-digit numbers, you would probably do that using symbols as opposed to an analog way. But we can also share symbols with other people, and we can share symbols with information technology. So the world of symbols and that form of complexity really overlaps the mind and the technologies we use. Now, the final type of complexity is driven by the external world. It's essentially how the world rewards and punishes the particular state we have chosen to exist in. And this is a world of peaks and valleys. This comes out of the evolutionary biology view of complexity. And the idea is that organisms in such a world try to migrate to fitness peaks, and we try to stay on fitness peaks. And really the complexity of this world depends upon how much interaction there is between all the variables. Now, when we talk about experienced complexity, what we're talking about is people achieving a comfortable level of arousal. And what we find is that if you do not have enough information coming in, you get bored and you basically stop processing information out of boredom and inattention. If too much information is coming in, we have information overload. Somewhere in the middle is a sweet spot where we match the rate at which information comes in with our cognitive processing. Now, over long periods of time, we can adapt to higher optimum information loads or lower optimum information loads, but that adaptation takes place very slowly. And so what we try to do if we're getting too much information is we try to come up with shortcuts and heuristic to reduce our processing. And if we're getting too little information, we come up with other activities to do that can go in parallel. One of the things that information technology has done is it has fundamentally altered the sort of base levels of all three complexities. And moving from left to right on the slide, as we become increasingly connected, as data becomes increasingly accessible, and as technology advances the types of things we can do with our computer systems, it impacts the pace at which things change. We can actually respond to changes and adapt to them much more quickly in our systems. This is an example is the success of supply chains, which are ultimately driven by information technology. What information technology also does is it increases the number of possible states that we can occupy. We get more choices than we used to have. So technology allows us to move to places in the fitness landscape that were not accessible before. Think about how autonomous vehicles will change the way we transport ourselves. Right now, we don't have them, but 10 years down the road, we will, and when we do, that is going to allow us to do things that we could never do before. Finally, our ability to automate tasks, even tasks like facial recognition, is changing the way that we collaborate with systems. So, moving over one more to the right, the effect of these technologies is to increase the extrinsic complexity. In other words, the states that we can occupy and the fitness of those states. And it also increases the intrinsic complexity, the size of the systems that we're working. Both of those will tend to increase experience complexity. So that's what we experience. It's the difficulty, it's the stress, it's the uncertainty. The problem is we're not going to accept that, and so we're going to apply various heuristics. We'll rely increasingly on experts to make our decisions for us. Those can be human experts or machine-based experts. We can use imitation more effectively. Basically find groups of people who are self-similar to us and imitate them. We can disengage from tasks. You know, when you see your students on their cell phones, maybe they're distracted, or maybe they're trying to take a break from the cognitive loads that they're experiencing. In the long run, we may be able to adapt to higher cognitive loads, but that is going to take more time. We can use our old heuristics even when they don't work because they simplify things. If you look at the field of economics, practically all the heuristics that are used in that field don't work, but they're better than nothing. So we're still talking about the Phillips curve, even though it's been 20 or 30 years since the relationship between inflation and employment specified by the Phillips curve was useful for predicting anything. Finally, we can shorten our time horizons. We don't have to worry. We don't look as far into the future because the calendar future is, of course, constant, but the rate of change is making even 2 years down the road seem a lot more distant than it used to seem. So, graduates who are entering the workforce or entering society at this time of life basically are experiencing all these different forms of complexity. And if you think about what a millennial faces, or what Generation Z faces, there are a lot of issues that someone graduating, say, in the early 1960s would not face. The instability of career paths. We expect many, many different career shifts over our life. The diversity of relationships. There's no longer single and married. There is a whole variety of different relationships that are sanctioned and sometimes encouraged by society. We are paying less attention to religion on average. Religion created a lot of rules that essentially reduced the extrinsic complexity we experience by saying, no, you should not enter this particular state. Gender and class stereotypes have been shattered. Now, you can argue that many of these things are very good things, but what they do is they open up options that were not available before, forcing us to make choices that we never had to make before, adding to our cognitive load. We're increasingly specialized at work. You can no longer have a job title like a computer programmer. Now you have to be in a very, very specialized area, and you have to make those choices much earlier. And of course, we have many, many more channels through which we can be informed. Just over the past 20 years, the internet has become a viable channel for things like video. Smartphones, which have totally replaced regular phones, even though they're really good at everything except making phone calls, now provide multiple tools. We have different, we've got social networks, we've got professional network. All of these things did not exist, and the question is, how do we choose to attend to the different channels? So, how is the current generation dealing with this experienced complexity? Well, one thing is we're using homophily, imitating self-similar individuals, forming clusters. Social networks makes this much, much easier. We're relying more and more on our peers to inform us, and particularly those peers who have attitudes similar to us, creating echo chambers. We do a lot of task switching, multitasking, which of course we can't really do. We can switch tasks very quickly, but we can't really attend to two tasks at the same time. We no longer have the same loyalty to jobs that we had because we don't expect the organizations employing us to exhibit much loyalty towards us. Enforcing orthodoxy. One of the challenges of a fitness landscape is that when it's very complex, little tiny changes can have a big impact. And as a result, we are much less tolerant of variations from the orthodoxy of the groups that we belong to than we used to be. We limit our informing channels to reduce the amount of stress. So if you're on the left, you're going to be comfortable with MSNBC and you'll walk out of any room where Fox News is playing. If you're on the right, you're in the exact opposite. Finally, we have short time horizons. The current generation has accumulated huge amounts of debts not tied to physical assets, i.e. student loans. And these student loans are not necessarily to get into careers that will pay more so that they can pay back the loan. We don't worry about them until we've actually accumulated. We also have tremendous pessimism in the future. The Generation Z and the millennials have a higher suicide rate, a higher stress rate than all these previous generations. And this, in a sense, can be viewed as a reaction to the complexity of the world they face. So, what do we do about this? Well, about 25 years ago, I, with my department, did a study of employers asking, what skills are you looking for? And I was in information systems department, so I was expecting answers like SQL and what programming language they should be learning. We never got that. We always got the same 4 answers. Communication skills was always number 1. Problem-solving skills, the ability to collaborate, work in groups, and the ability to learn. So when I was preparing this presentation, I did a very, very unscientific search on Google saying, what do employers want? And those same 4 skills still appear, but 2 new skills are now appearing on most of the lists that were definitely not there before. One is creativity, and the other, which I find particularly informative, is resilience. In a world where there is high complexity and high levels of arousal, resilience becomes very, very important. So, when we were looking at those original skills, communication meant oral communication and written communication. Today, there's a whole lot more skills that our graduates need to have. They need to be able to fit the communication to the appropriate medium, which can vary significantly from person to person. I hadn't realized it, but email is only used by dinosaurs. Appropriate sharing. When you're trying to identify with a group, it's useful to share lots of stuff. We might say overshare for those of us in my generation. You have to understand what level of sharing is appropriate and inappropriate, and just choosing the right channels through which to communicate. Wrong direction. Problem solving. In the old days, problem solving meant finding the right answer. We learned algorithms. We learned reductive reasoning, break a problem up into tiny components that are easier to solve. Now, we're looking at experimentation, data sourcing. Search becomes more important than knowledge, and we're not looking for the right answer, we're looking for a fit answer, and this is a result of extrinsic complexity. When we look at collaboration, in the old days we were talking about working in local groups and breaking up tasks to share them. Today, we're sharing tasks with people, but with technology as well. We need to find ways to benefit from the diversity of groups in a very positive way, remembering that in many cases, the homophilous groups that we create do not seek out diversity, they rather seek out commonality of opinion. We have to learn how to work and collaborate separated by distance and time. If you look at my information systems master's class, the last time I taught it, I had 40 students. 38 were from India, 1 was from Thailand, and 1 was from the US, but he actually had an Indian father. That group is going to require collaboration techniques that are very, very different, as anyone who's dealt with offshored companies will understand. The ability to learn. In the old days, learning meant learning acquired in the classroom, acquired from mentors. Today, we're increasingly looking for self-directed learning, just-in-time learning, but we have to figure out what are appropriate data sources, and we have to learn from experiments, because causality in an extrinsically complex world doesn't really mean that much, because it's so complicated to express. It's much, much easier just to experiment and see what happens. Now, moving on to creativity. In the old days, creativity was something we'd worry about later. Okay, well, not, if you were an advertising agency hiring a copy developer, okay, maybe you'd worry about creativity, but in most companies, you didn't get to be creative for a very long time, and it was only needed for some jobs. Today, we have to be creative in order to react to the continual change that we experience from our environment. We have to be creative in finding resources because there are so many resources we have to figure out what to zero in on. We have to be creative in designing experiments that will help us understand how our environment reacts. The last one, resilience. In the old days, we kind of assumed resilience. Hey, if you weren't resilient, you got fired. Today, many of our students grow up in echo chambers where they're literally having their views constantly reinforced, and then they enter the workforce where they actually have to encounter extrinsic complexity and the fact that not every action you take produces a trophy. And this is, we can't assume it anymore. In addition, older jobs tended to be routine, and one of the things about experience complexity is if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, the cognitive demands it places on you get much lower, and as a result, you don't feel the stress from routineness that you do under constant change. Today, our students have to cope with high arousal. They have to avoid disengaging at the wrong times. Disengaging when things become tough is a good strategy for reducing arousal, but it's not a good strategy for getting the job done. And finally, we have to be much more adaptable to change than we used to be. So the question is, how do we design curriculum to fit this? In the old days, we looked at the 4 skills separately. Literally, when we were redesigning our curriculum 25 years ago, we said, okay, well, let's see, this course we're going to have communication. This course is a problem-solving course. This course is one on collaboration because we'll have group work. And this course, involves them actually learning something. That's what led to effectiveness. Today, essentially, all 6 of these characteristics are interlocked. You really can't look at them independently. And you have to design things that use measures of each, like the ingredients of a recipe, that interact together to produce a positive outcome. Again, this is extrinsic complexity that we're dealing with. So, what I did in yesterday's session is I went around the room asking people to talk about different techniques that they were using that seemed to be a good fit with the millennial generation. And what I am going to do now is just briefly summarize some of the things that we talked about and just identify how I think they fit this new model. And my apologies to the people whose work I am summarizing in 30 seconds and undoubtedly butchering, but I've given their names and they are not responsible for it, but you can talk to them later in the presentation about exactly what they're doing. So I started off with an example of mine. I use case discussions a lot in my classes. Case discussions deal with real-world situations for which there is not a right answer. And the idea of the discussion process is to encourage members of the class to come up with new ideas and then test these ideas based upon the assumptions in the case. When we conduct these discussions online, it's done asynchronously, and people come in and out of the discussion making comments on what each individual has said. So this basically develops our focus on a fit answer, because guess what? It's not like every solution to a decision that needs to be made in a case is a good one. In fact, there are many decisions that really suck. So what we're trying to do is find decisions that make sense, but sometimes lead you down very, very different paths. Just the way the recipes within a given cookbook can differ dramatically from each other, but that doesn't mean one is better or worse than the other. It really depends upon what the context is. Cases also contain a lot of information that's relevant and irrelevant, and you have to sort between them. So this is an example of sort of data sourcing skills. Collaboration, case discussions really benefit from diversity in the classroom. If everybody comes in with the same opinion, It's very, very hard to have an interesting discussion. But one of the things we discover is that people have very, very different opinions. And that helps us as they're forced to sort of bolster their opinions with facts. Resilience, one of the things I do is I call on folks to open cases, cold call, and that produces a very high level of arousal. And a lot of people get very, very nervous talking in public, and so these are the types of things that I'm hoping to benefit with this. Another activity I do is a debate activity, and I'm just going to go over this one very quickly. I assign groups of students to support pro and con arguments of resolutions such as within 50 years AI will be capable of the same type of common sense reasoning that only humans can perform today, and they have to go out and research it, create a presentation, and then we discuss the presentations. It turns out this activity works better online than it does face-to-face, so I make my students create video presentations and then have a discussion after that. Again, no right answer. Going out, finding data, using appropriate sources, collaborating in the production of the presentation, and forcing people to take perspectives other than the one they necessarily have, because I assign people to pro and con team at random. They don't get to choose which side they have to argue for. Okay, the next one, Arjun Singh. Basically, he is a doctoral student in India, finishing up his doctorate in instructional technology, and what he provided was a whole series of different types of activities that fit this model. Project-based learning, which supports your problem solving. It involves discussions, research, working. That hits basically all of them. Experiential learning, another very good tool for preparing today's generation for the workforce. They do simulation tasks and role-playing as well as actual hands-on tasks. Collaborative learning, we're seeing that a lot in business schools. Many times other colleges, such as engineering and arts and sciences, are a little behind in encouraging students to work in groups, but that's very important. And of course, technology-enabled learning, which is basically helping our students learn how to share tasks effectively with technology. Arianna Akan Matamoros is doing distance learning classes from a university in Costa Rica, and they're dealing with the challenge of communicating effectively over distance and time, sharing with technology. They are doing linkages to real-world tools such as 3D printing, and they're making use of things like virtual reality simulation and 3D reality as ways of engaging the students. Forces people to think about how they communicate, think about appropriate online sources, a lot of self-directed learning in that program. Maria Placencia Medina is in instructional design, and what they're doing is designing activities using a framework inspired by Miller and by Bloom that has a series of stages that include resolution, whose focus is knowledge, procedures, and particularly working on the attitudes of students, which is very important when you're dealing with experience complexity. Collaboration in a domain where there are large cultural differences among the students, and the use of information technology in collaboration. They also specifically focus on self-learning and resilience, coping with higher arousal levels than you're used to, avoiding disengaging when things become too difficult. Marcus Greene is he's in the Doctor of Business Administration program that I run at the University of South Florida, and he provided an example of cohort self-organized informal learning activities. And his cohort has made extensive use of Slack, which they selected themselves. Those of us who are running the program had absolutely nothing to do with this. This was entirely self-organized, and students are helping each other with assignments, offering support to each other, and because of their conflicting schedules, all the people in this program are executives, and nearly all are employed. Their interactions with each other have to be asynchronous. So this is an example of self-directed on-demand learning, sharing with technology, benefiting from the diverse skill sets within the cohort, choosing their own channel, doing activities that fit the medium involved. And the good news is I didn't have to do anything for that. They all did this themselves. And increasingly, creating venues that encourage self-organized learning is going to be very important. Donald Ropes, a feature presenter here, has done a consultancy project with his students where the students have to go out and consult for a small or medium enterprise. Students need to define the problem to be addressed and get agreement from the enterprise that that's the right problem. And finding out the right problem is a huge challenge in something like this. They have to conduct research with each other, go across multiple media, develop feasible solutions, and this all has to be done in a 10-week time frame. I literally could have put something for all 6 of those areas in this type of activity. Maria Cernik is basically doing coached problem solving, and this is being done in the classroom where they give the students in her informatics class a complex problem to solve, and then they have a coach help them break down that problem into pieces that they can accomplish, and then ultimately work together to solve the problem. The problems are authentic problems. For example, they'll take a web page table, like one of these big tables on a web page, and then automatically write code to convert it to normalized database forms. So the authenticity of the problems adds to the effectiveness of the activity. And again, this type of activity moves across nearly all of the different levels. Annamaria Beltrocchi has a storytelling activity. She works in a media lab in Ecuador where the student population is very diverse, both economically and culturally. The students are good at telling stories about themselves. A lot of cultures have a strong storytelling tradition, but they're not so good at telling stories about each other. So each student is required to develop, research, and tell a story about his or her community. And this is an excellent example of effective communication, because communication using storytelling is one of the most effective ways of conveying a message. Obviously, there's a problem-solving element. You have to figure out where you're going to get the data on your community. You're searching for this rather than basically using your knowledge to solve the problem. It is one that supports tremendous diversity. It involves sharing with technology, and it's very, very self-directed. So this is an excellent example of the types of things that fit today's needs. Finally, Rize Blair, she teaches distance learning she teaches using distance learning at a variety of different universities, and she had a long list of activities that she supports that fit this type of model. She has the class essentially design a small business startup, encouraging creativity, problem solving, communication. She uses Twitter to teach, opening up a new communication channel that students don't normally encounter and encouraging new types of collaboration. She has an online internship, which again is a form of experiential learning that moves well across these different goals. She builds relationships with nonprofits, which students go in and interact with. Again, this is an experiential, service-oriented learning. And she has an externship where students are required to actually go out and find a company to work with on their own. Again, demonstrating all sorts of different forms of initiative and building a whole set of new skills. So, that is basically what I have got. We will save the questions for the end, but one thing I want to encourage is I have not done justice to any of the techniques that I have been profiling. So I gave people's names. Seek them out during the conference. Ask about them. I know that they'll be happy to chat with you. And with that, I will pause.